Moore had stopped after making these two, I would just think of him as a minor footnote in the history of the film series. Fortunately, 1977's The Spy Who Loved Me would establish Moore's Bond persona and take him through 4 additional films. Moore's Bond really started for me during the opening teaser in Spy. Bond is in bed with a beautiful woman, is chased by bad guys, and makes a spectacular escape, with some humor and a wink to the audience. This ski chase opening still is one of the best stunts the series has done and is just as exciting to watch 30 years later. Just one long take with no edits. That's something audiences see less and less of nowadays. Plus the joke with the Union Jack parachute is a great topper. Bond's world in Spy is filled with outrageous gadgets and beautiful women. The set pieces are huge and the villains are larger than life. Typical Bond stuff. But unlike Connery's films, this one doesn't take it as seriously. It's as if they're saying we're just going to have fun, sit back and enjoy it. At one point, while Bond is walking through the desert, the theme from Lawrence of Arabia comes up, just for the benefit of the audience to give them a chuckle. It's more like a fantasy adventure than a straight-up spy thriller. And it's a lot of fun. Barbara Bach is smoking as the KGB agent Anya. She's one of the hottest Bond girls. We meet the giant henchman Jaws, one of the most memorable Bond adversaries. You either love him or hate him, I guess. Some might feel he's too cartoonish, but in this flick I think he's menacing and just believable enough to be entertaining. And he fits right in with the whole feel of the film. Stromberg is an okay villain. He mainly says some icy dialogue and pushes a lot of buttons with his webbed hands. His underwater hideout is pretty cool though. Q's gadgets are all over the place. Getting to see all the outrageous stuff he's working on is pretty fun. The car chase with the Lotus results in a cool chase on the road and underwater. The battle inside the oil tanker is impressive and is a worthwhile climax to the film. At the end of the credits of The Spy Who Loved Me, it was announced that Bond would return in For Your Eyes Only. However, filmmakers reconsidered after seeing the success of Star Wars, so it was decided it was time to send 007 into space. Now, Moonraker gets a lot of attention, mostly negative. The main reason is the idea of sending James Bond into space. That alone makes it the most unique Bond film. However outlandish, silly, and unbelievable the series had gotten before, this film took it to a whole new level for fans. This one would get as far away from the down-to-earth, intrigue-filled spy thrillers that gave birth to the character as any in the series. It would also escalate the comic fantasy elements that was started in The Spy Who Loved Me. And it was the biggest Bond hit up to that point. Now I'm going to go easy on this one. There is some fun stuff in here. The best part is probably the opening teaser. Sure, it gets silly when Jaws is flapping his arms and lands on a circus tent, but it doesn't detract from the impressive stunt work that make up the sequence. For me, that scene alone was more entertaining than Moore's first 2 Bond films. In the first half, the film has a few good action scenes sprinkled throughout and some pretty nice locations. The Venice chase isn't bad until it ends on an over-the-top joke. The cable car fight would have been much more effective if the use of blue screening wasn't so blatant. And again, it ends on an over-the-top joke. They manage to squeeze some suspense when Bond is trapped in the centrifuge. It's one of the few times Moore's Bond looks truly helpless, and Moore plays it completely straight with no witty quips. Dr. Goodhead's most distinguishing characteristic is her name. She doesn't make much more of an impression than that. The villain, Hugo Drax, is nothing really special either. Just an extremely droll performance. He does have some cool villain lines.
You appear with the tedious inevitability of an unloved season.
How cool is that? But the most striking thing about him are the huge sets he walks around in. The return of Jaws might have been a good idea if he was played less for laughs. Such a unique henchman should carry a certain amount of menace and threat to the hero. Here he acts like Herman Munster. And having him fall in love and become Bond's ally in the end? Nah. There's just an overabundance of sight gags and silly jokes in the film. The second half of the film, where Bond finally makes it to space, is where things really get too much. The inevitable space battle climax is not very exciting. It's not the easiest thing to make a slow-mo action scene thrilling. For me, it's not my least favorite film in the series, or even of Moore's. Admittedly, it doesn't consistently deliver, but it's never boring. The best thing that can be said about it is it doesn't try to pretend to be anything more than what it aimed to be. A silly piece of fluff entertainment. Despite Moonraker being a huge hit, filmmakers decided to bring 007 back to Earth. I can't imagine what they would have done otherwise. The inevitable battle cry of reeling back Bond and sending him out on more believable adventures was decided. They decided to get away from the overuse of gadgets, the humor, and get back to the basics of the character. The result was For Your Eyes Only. Initially, the filmmakers weren't sure Roger Moore would be returning as Bond. The opening sequence of Bond visiting Tracy's grave was meant to establish a connection between a new actor in the role and the history of the character. While Moore is always pigeonholed as doing a light comedic portrayal of 007, For Your Eyes Only is the best example of showing Moore's Bond in a darker light and playing the role seriously. The promise of stripping away all the gadgets and humor which was so prevalent in Moore's past outings is delivered. This is simply a straight spy thriller with no gimmicks or winking at the audience. There is some light humor. The teaser opening with the return of Blofeld has its moments, along with one of the oddest pieces of dialogue in the history of the series.
I'll buy you a delicatessen in stainless steel!
The rest of the film, the humor is really toned down. In For Your Eyes Only, Bond is simply assigned to retrieve the ATAC device and not let it fall into the villain's hands. Very straightforward. I think the best Bond films usually have a very uncomplicated plot, a simple straight thread you can easily follow along with while the filmmakers hang an occasional action scene from while Bond gets closer to the objective. The action scenes are consistently great throughout the film. Bond survives most of them through his ingenuity and doesn't get an easy save from Q's gadgets. Although Q does show up to help move the story along with his identigraph, which today might look cheesy, but still, it's more fun than watching Bond flip through mugshots. At the start of the car chase, where we normally would see Bond jump in his gadget-filled car, it simply gets blown up. He ends up having to rely on the most un-Bond-like car possible, but the chase is still very cool. The ski sequences are exciting, fast-paced, and nicely put together, and go alongside some of the best action scenes the series has done. A highlight is a scene Fleming originally wrote in Live and Let Die, when Bond and Melina are tied and dragged through sharp coral and shark-infested waters. It's really a nice evil idea. The climax of Bond mountain climbing his way up to the villain's lair is a tense scene, and Bond's fall is mesmerizing to watch. Today they would have probably just done this with cheesy CGI effects, but realizing these stunts were actually performed by someone for real makes them all the more impressive to watch. Cast is all pretty good. Christos is a charming villain. He puts on a persuasive act that makes it convincing Bond would fall for him as an ally. Columbo is a fun pirate-like character, and although Bibi the skater is admittedly annoying, I think she's just meant to be. The henchmen all look pretty mean and could do some damage to Bond. Oh, and yes, Tula the transsexual is somewhere in this pool scene. The one scene when Bond coldly kicks the assassin's car off the cliff is particularly memorable and very un-Moore-like. Supposedly Moore was reluctant to even film it, but it's a real highlight in the film. Melina I've always thought was somewhat bland and her performance is kind of stiff. I think the character deserved a stronger actress to play her rather than a model with little acting experience. She's not the worst Bond girl, but definitely not the best either. Despite Moore's age and stretching the plausibility of being convincing as Bond, some shots, like when he's walking around with Bibi, it looks borderline criminal. Moore would return, but he would leave this serious interpretation of Bond behind and would get back to his trademark lighter style.